In this video, I am going to show you how I make my dungeon tiles. One side represents the outdoors. The other side represents the interior of a dungeon. There are many possible combinations, but for this tutorial, we are going to make an L-shaped corner. For the dungeon, you can see it's the corner of a room. For the outdoors, I'm using a corner next to a water source. I've cut down some XPS foam into 4" by 4" squares. On each of these tiles, I am going to measure and etch 1" squares, 1" representing 5 feet. I do this on both sides, and depending on which pattern I am using, I don't necessarily do all 4 squares per side. For this one, I did not do the L shape. I just did the square tiles inside of that. For the L-shaped corner, I am using a dull pencil and I have sketched out the pattern, and now I am scoring each of the tiles out, some relatively deep cuts. Don't worry if you have any mistakes, because it is a dungeon, and so if the pencil goes off of your line and you cut into a tile, well, you have a crack. I also like to bevel the edges on both sides of the tile. It's not necessary. This is just something that I like to do. To me, it makes it more attractive. In order to give the 3D effect that I've done on my tiles, I also like to draw on the walls, the top of the wall. I made a 1/4" line and I score that, and that's going to be the part that I'm going to paint the lightest gray. If there's a corner piece, make sure you draw a line from the top of the wall to the corner of the floor. This will just aid in the illusion of 3 dimensions. Now with the dull pencil, I start drawing in the rocks of the walls. For the best effect, you want to draw the rocks bigger on the top of the wall and smaller as it gets closer to your floor. A wood burner would probably be more effective, but since I don't have one of those, I use my X-Acto knife and I trace out the lines of my rocks. Once I've finished tracing the lines with the X-Acto knife, I get the dull pencil back out, and that's when I start going through and tracing each of those cuts. The reason I do that is because it bevels each of those and kind of rounds off my rocks and gives more dimension to my floor tiles. I could also enhance any cracks. I start usually with the pencil, and then I will use the X-Acto knife later so that I could have much finer cracks towards the end. Once I'm done with that, I get the X-Acto out again, and I start digging out some of the little chunks that have popped up and just kind of clean it up a little bit. To give the foam the appearance of a rock texture, it's really easy. Just grab some aluminum foil, roll it up into a ball, and start pressing it into the foam. I like to also make sure I go over the edges as well. I bought my supplies at Home Depot. For each side of the foam, I pressed in a hole for a screw and another hole for a magnet. If you looked at the side and imagined the 4 tiles, I put my hole in the middle of the 2 center tiles, and I did it on all 4 sides. Now here you want to be consistent. So I made sure to look at the tile with the dungeon side facing up, and I put the screws on the right of the 2 holes on each of the 4 sides. That way when it faced another tile, the magnet was going to touch the screw, either way you looked at it. I got a screwdriver and I made sure to screw it in all the way until it was just a little bit more than flush. That way it would definitely touch the magnet on the next tile over. Now for the magnets. Again, these I bought at Home Depot. I think it was like $6 for 40 of them. They were 1/2 inch, so I used a 1/2 inch drill bit, and by hand I just drilled out a hole that was slightly bigger than the magnet, big enough to where I could put a little bit of hot glue in there and have the magnet in and have it flush with the tile, if not sticking out just a very little bit, a 1/16 of an inch. I've heard some people say that you could use another smaller screw and super glue the magnet onto the screw after you've screwed it into the tile. But I used our hot glue gun, and I haven't had no issues with any of the magnets slipping out. I've played around with the tiles, flipped them around, put them in different order, and I've never had any issues with the tiles with the magnets falling out. Now that the tile is done, here comes the part that's going to bring it to life. The first thing I did was apply a base coat. I chose to paint the tiles completely black for my undercoat. It is possible you can use a dark gray, or you could basically do it any color you want. It's just gonna help out for when you try doing the dry brushing later. After it has dried, that's when it comes time to do the dry brushing. What I chose to do for my dungeon inside tiles was used gray, some black, and some white. I dry brushed the gray on first, across the whole tile. Now the key to dry brushing is you dip your brush in the paint, and then on the paper plate or paper towel, kind of wipe off most of the paint until the brush almost feels dry. There is a little bit of paint on it. As you can see, you could just rub it back and forth, and it covers the top parts of the texture, and your undercoat sticks out, and that's one of the main things that gives it the appearance of rock. Once I finished with the gray, I went ahead and went to the lighter color, which is the top of the walls. I just got white, and since the paint that I'd used was still a little bit wet, the white was able to blend with the gray a little bit. And as I painted on the white, once it started, there was less and less on the brush, I went ahead and started kind of blending it in with the top of the walls to give it kind of a gradient effect there. And then finally, I also used a little bit of the white on top of my tiles, dry brush only, just to give some highlights, and kind of it ends up making it stand out from the bottom of the walls. Now for the bottom of the walls, I just put a little bit of black paint on the tip of my brush, ran it straight across the bottom of the wall, and then as the paint ran out, I just started dry brushing that and smoothing it out up to about the halfway point of the wall. I also covered the corner a little bit, and then I also dry brushed the cracks in the space in between the tiles. It just kind of helps it out, but the main purpose of it is to give it a gradient effect to where the bottom of the wall is darker and it fades into the lighter top part of the wall. There are a million ways that you can go about doing this. I'm just showing you the way that I chose to do it. But regardless, once it's all said and done, here you see it's a beautiful dungeon corner piece. Now it's time to flip the tile over and do the outside. This, I like to use 3 different shades of green and 3 different shades of blue, since I'm doing grass and water. For these, I usually start with the darker color. So what I do is I dry brush the green over the black. It just kind of gives it a little bit of depth. The black ends up being kind of the shadow in the grass. And I will just dry brush this on and just kind of hope. I'm still looking for better ways to do my outdoor effects, but for the time being, they're looking pretty decent. After I'm content with the dark color, that's when I'll go ahead and get the lighter color, and sometimes even just the white, and I'll kind of dry brush that on top, and it just kind of makes it stand out a little bit more. Next, I do the water. I start with the dark color on the outside, and since this is like a coastline, I went ahead and used the dark color followed by the light color in the middle, and then I went around the actual coastline with pure white, and I kind of blended it in with the lighter blue, and then I ended up trying to make some, like waves as if it's crashing onto the shore. And here is what the corner piece of my outdoor tile looks like. The nice thing is with these tiles is you could mix and match them in many different combinations. And as you can see here, this represents a road that goes up to a dungeon, and here's a little part of the dungeon. And overall, I'm very happy with the way it's turned out. This is the first video on my YouTube channel, Dungeons and Designs.